welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Pete.
Absolutely. First things first, I would like each of you guys to sort of tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about this journey that led you from where you were to Asheville at this evening. We'll start with Katharine.
So you can tell from my bio, can everybody hear me? Okay. You can tell from my bio that I have had a little bit of a schizophrenic journey that has cut across academia, nonprofits, social enterprise, business. It's been a melange, let's say. I am kind of a hopeless interdisciplinarian, and through the course of that journey of sort of traversing these different spaces, I've learned that I really love the intersections, and I like playing a role of kind of translator between these different worlds or sectors that sometimes are not so good at being in conversation with one another. The journey has always had this connecting thread of sustainability, which really has, in many ways, its roots in Western North Carolina. I spent 4 months maybe there are other Outdoor Academy folks in the audience, living in the woods with a bunch of 16-year-olds when I was 16. And that was a super formative experience for me, both intellectually and emotionally and spiritually, in terms of sort of sending me on this journey to spend my one wild and precious life working on these issues.
John, what about your journey?
So, I mean, my work at CNN, I've been there about almost 9 years now, I guess, has been, a lot of it's been focused on trying to engage our audience in important conversations that maybe they would be inclined to tune out. And so I think one of the biggest and most important conversations like that right now is climate change. So the last several, few years there, I've really been focused on trying to get that conversation going more robustly. Before the 2 Degrees Project, which you mentioned, I ran this initiative at CNN called Change the List, and readers would suggest topics, and then actually we had online polls where they would choose like the issues that they wanted to send me out into the world to cover, and that went on for a couple years. I really like this idea of a more democratic form of journalism where people are actually acting as editors in stories and selecting stories and getting involved in trying to make a difference. So that sort of morphed, partly because I got a lot of emails from people saying, why aren't you doing climate change as part of this project, into the 2 Degrees Initiative, which was sort of in the year leading up to the Paris climate talks, trying to get people to wrestle with this one super important number, 2 degrees Celsius, which is sort of the international threshold for dangerous warming. So that's kind of been my focus. I keep coming back to environmental issues because they're very important to me personally, but it's also something that I just think is a really important conversation that we need to be having right now.
Great. Katharine, your first book was called Between God and Green. Can you talk a little bit about the book and if and how it led you to the Drawdown project?
Sure. So the impetus of that book really emerged my first year of working out of undergrad. I was working for the Natural Resources Defense Council on forest and land use issues on the Cumberland Plateau. So I was spending a lot of time in rural Tennessee and in Nashville with the governor's office, and my boss was in New York, right? Most of these big environmental NGOs are headquartered in New York and San Francisco with some lobbying in DC. And I was really struck by how much the environmental movement was just speaking right past the audiences that it ought to at least try to engage. And this was smack in the middle of the second Bush term. And this group called the Evangelical Climate Initiative launched with a full-page ad in the New York Times that said, "Our commitment to Jesus Christ compels us to solve the global warming crisis." All of these heavyweights in the evangelical world, more sort of moderate evangelical leaders, had signed on to this. I'd studied religion in undergrad, and I'd been thinking about the intersection of these things and was totally surprised by this emergence. But it seemed like there might be some interesting lessons there about moving the needle on political will and public engagement, and things that the secular environmental movement might learn about the role of values and story, and beliefs. So I dug into that sort of burgeoning evangelical climate movement through my PhD research, which ended up getting morphed into that book. What was really interesting about that was kind of sitting on the sidelines and thinking about what are the stories that we're telling? How are we framing this issue? What does that mean for the action that we take or don't take? And how do we do this more effectively? So I kind of left that work for a few years as I focused on consulting, but it was a question that still was really with me. But I also stepped away from it because I sort of hit a point after doing that research and doing that work that I was like, I cannot work on climate change every day. This is too depressing, and I, you know, I was like, I really don't know how to spend my days in the doom and gloom and stay sane, which we can come back to.
Sanity?
Yeah. And so it was actually through a consulting project for Interface. That is definitely Interface tile out in the lobby. I'm assuming this is here too. But I was helping Interface with their codifying their purpose and values and thinking about their next corporate mission, what's next after mission zero. And that's when I met Paul. And so when Paul told me about Project Drawdown, it hit me not just from a sort of academic, intellectual, this is such a big need in the climate space, but also a really personal
And of course, you're referring
place.
to Paul Hawken.
Sorry, yes. Paul Hawken, who is the founder and executive director of Project Drawdown. And I was like, wow, this is such important work, and I felt very sort of moved by it. And one thing led to another, and I ended up joining the team. So it was very interesting to go from having been in an academics role, right, of kind of analyzing someone else's effort to communicate climate change and move people to action, to then actually being in that role in Drawdown.
John, I spent a lot of time looking at the different body work that you've put together and noticed that a lot of it doesn't necessarily focus on issues or events, but on people. Do you think that focusing on telling people's stories has a greater impact than just focusing on issues? And let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of the work that I've done, it has an issue in it, but I tend to lead with people. I want people to be the heart of the stories that I'm doing, because that's what we connect to, right? I mean, that's like storytelling is the way that we try to make sense of the world, and hearing that from a person's perspective and trying to build that empathy, I think is really powerful, whether you're talking about climate change or another issue. Like, I mean, I think people have also been like almost flattened in the discussion of climate change. Like we spend a lot of time talking about the science and the numbers, and I talk about that stuff too, but I think that the people who are living with the consequences of warming, which is all of us in some respect, but some people are feeling it much more acutely, that their voices need a larger presence on the global stage. So I've gone to a lot of the far-flung places where there are very visible and dramatic problems, and tried to elevate that into the global conversation. And I think what's at the heart of that is something that the Pope has really highlighted and made a big difference on, is the injustice of climate change. I'm sure that's something people in this room have thought about, but the richest of us in the world are largely causing this problem, and it's affecting the poorest among us the most drastically, right? Like, I've been to communities in Madagascar that depend on coral reefs for their survival, and those are bleaching because of warming. I've been to the Marshall Islands, where sea level rise is threatening to displace an entire culture. Villages in Alaska that are melting. I mean, they're really dramatic now examples of where our inability to change our energy and food systems are, causing real pain and hardship for people. And so I've tried to bring those voices into it, and to do that in a way, not always successfully, but like in a way that you can relate to others just as humans. Like, when I was in the Marshall Islands, I did this kind of goofy thing almost on Snapchat, where I was doing sort of daily stories while I was out, doing my reporting and making videos and whatever else for CNN. Kind of between that, I was getting questions from readers and followers, like while I was there, just really basic stuff, like what language do they speak? Like what do people eat in the Marshall Islands? Just kind of like, like intrigue kind of things, almost travelogue-y stuff. And I made those took those questions and made them into like little, 24-hour stories on Snapchat disappear after a 24-hour period. And I kind of try to use that medium as a way to underscore what's happening there, which is that an entire culture and language and food system, all these things are, threatened with disappearance because of what we're doing. And when I've met people who read that story, or I got emails about it afterwards, like a lot of times people would say to me that was the most moving part, was seeing these little bitty, like sort of, like slices of life and thinking about what the implications of these connections are. And so I think like some of that was just trying to bring life and relatability to a place that may otherwise seem very distant. Like I always like to say that and I didn't know this before I went, but there's a word in Marshallese. The word for hello is Yahweh, and that word also means I love you, and it also means you are a rainbow. Like all in one word.
Which makes it the best word.
Which makes it
in
the best
world.
word. But it gives you a sense of like the joy and like the vibrancy to like that culture. And I think sometimes all of that gets flattened in this discussion of like of villains and heroes and victims. It's all of us that are in this thing together. So,
do you have a favorite person that you've interviewed over the years?
I don't know. I'd choose a favorite, like one from this year that like may be pertinent to this, to like our discussion about how we all have this conversation about climate change. Is I spent a couple weeks earlier this year in Emery County, Utah, which, according to this Yale program on climate change communication, is by one of their metrics at least the most skeptical county in the country in terms of climate science. And so there was a guy there I met named Gordon Olson, and he's a third-generation coal miner. His sons are the fourth. What I really liked about him were a few things. One, he made me see climate skepticism in a different way, and two, he's just like a complicated person, like we all are, right? I think we easily lump each other into groups, like climate skeptic, and we think coal miner, we think all these associations with that. And he defied like a lot of, like stereotypes and preconceived notions. Like he took me to this, Emery County is in this very like sort of beautiful desert landscape, a lot of the county is at least. And he took me to like the edge of this cliff, and we're like overlooking like this vista that like is kind of a mini Grand Canyon sort of scene. And he, was saying to me that, look how big and old and changing the world is. And we have, fossils in these rocks that are from a time when this was the ocean, and now it's like this extremely arid place. And like, the earth is big and old and wonderful, and we are so small, and we're here for such a small moment. He almost saw it as like an arrogance to think that we could be changing the climate in such a fundamental way. And I mean, the science says otherwise, right? Like there's agreement that we are doing that. But trying to empathize with the perspective from which he was seeing this discussion about climate really was moving for me. And just also like the complexity with which people think about these things. He was also very willing to engage in a conversation about it, which I think climate skeptics often get lumped into a group of people who are, almost like the internet trolls of the real world, and like don't want to talk to anybody about this and are combative. And there are people like that, but there are also a lot of people who are just sort of don't have a lot of information about it, and it's not something that they think is very pertinent to their day-to-day life. And so he really helped open up a chunk of the country to me in a more nuanced way, which I think is always healthy.
You mentioned the Yale program on climate change communication. They have something called the Six Americas study, and what they've done with that is categorize people from basically 1 to 6, and there's everything from folks who are alarmed, to concerned, to cautious, to disengaged, to doubtful, to dismissive. Katharine, when you guys were putting the book together, was there any particular demographic within that sort of 1 to 6 range that you were focused on? And did you sort of tweak the way you said things to address people?
No. John asked me earlier today, he was like, who was your audience for Drawdown? I was like, all the people, everyone. No, I think, so I'm just going to use this little support tool. So I went back to the Six Americas thing today. And I think there's some interesting things there that we were responsive to in Drawdown, but we weren't thinking about this audience segmentation. So 12% of the population is alarmed, right? So these are the most active, most informed group.
Who's alarmed here?
Right, okay.
All right,
So
so
we
we
have
know
the
who we're
alarm.
talking to now.
So one of the key points is that this group of folks often do not know what they or society can do. Great. So we're freaking out and we don't know what to do. Awesome. Okay, then we've got concerned, 29%. They see the problem primarily as a distant threat. Awesome, great. Humans not wired to deal with that. Okay, super. Our two best groups of people are totally ill-equipped. Awesome. And then we get to cautious. They also see a distant threat, and they also have no strong opinions on what, if anything, should be done. Okay, so then we go farther down, right? But what this means is even when people really care, we don't know what the solutions are. We don't know what to do. We're spinning our wheels, freaking out. And then we're trying to go through this like back door of the thing that humans aren't wired for, which is like we're squawking and screaming about an existential threat that's long term, even though there are ways that we're already feeling it. So we know that this doesn't work. And we know that we need other ways in. And I think when you go further down the kind of spectrum in the Yale study, you get to folks who are just grappling with the day-to-day realities of life. And that's the door in, right? Climate solutions, yes, we need them to address greenhouse gases. But what's more powerful is the impact they can have immediately on resilience and health and equity and jobs, right? Those of us who are spending most of our time thinking about climate change, like we want to talk about climate change. But that, I think, is not always the most fruitful way in. So I'm hopeful in some ways that the whole strategy of Drawdown, of focusing on solutions and also looking at the economics of solutions, gives us an entry point with basically everyone except for, the most dismissive folks. And even then, we might have some space for common ground.
When you're crafting your stories, are you focusing on any particular demographic?
I think a lot about this, and I don't have a great answer either. I mean, CNN's audience includes all of those groups, like certainly, and I hear from all of them, and so I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm writing for like in terms of thought and lots of other ways, but like a diverse group of people, like a broad cross section. And so I try to make things accessible. The longer I've written about climate, the more I try to almost over-explain the basics of it in every story, because I think that even, like people who are fairly familiar with climate change, some of the basics of it are like kind of confusing and can trip you up. And so I try to spell out like in a couple sentences, a paragraph, whatever, like how we know what we know a little bit, and just kind of give that background there, because not everyone is coming at this from the same place. And I will say that like during that 2 Degrees project, a lot of those stories came from questions from our audience. Like we had a Google form. It wasn't like high tech. Like we had a Google form where people could like send in their questions either about the number 2 degrees or about climate in general. And a lot of the stories came through that route. And so I saw these like, I can't remember the number, but in the thousands, I think, like these questions coming in about climate from our readers, and they were really a lot of like basic things about it. The question, but intriguing, right? Like, and not often explored in a way that is grabbing to people or that they can make sense of. So like a reader's question, like a woman in San Jose, like led me to that Marshall Islands story. She asked like, what happens to people who are displaced as the seas rise, and that got voted up in a poll and sent me off there. But all that to say, like I think that reaffirming like over and over and over again, like how much agreement there is in the scientific community. 97% or more of scientists agree that we're causing global warming, according to peer-reviewed research. I link to things like you want to give people any opportunity to come from one of the groups in the Six Americas who aren't like fully alarmed or concerned, and maybe like give them a reason to be intrigued. I also sometimes try to write into climate change without like screaming climate change in the headline in the lead paragraph. I'm not hiding the fact that I'm writing about climate change, but sometimes I'll talk about the place and the people or like an interesting situation first as a way to try to build like narrative tension or a situation that might pull you in just as a person, and then get you to start thinking about some of the science a little bit later on.
And so I hate the term fake news, but I'm going to use it now. So in it's so stupid. Anyway, in a world of fake news, how do we? This just sort of takes off on what we were just talking about. How do we educate people who are in those last two categories about things like gigatons and CO2, stuff that we can't see, when they have trouble believing stuff that is right in front of their face?
So I don't think we need to. I put that out there. See if John comes back at me.
Good tension.
Think about any complex problem that we face. Like no one thinks that the whole country has to be literate in health insurance markets and healthcare policy for us to be able to get to answers on healthcare. I mean, there are other reasons we're not getting to answers on healthcare, but like we don't depend on every single person getting it. I think this idea that every single person has to really understand it and then take a whole bunch of individual behaviors and then somehow maybe we'll get to a better place is just ass backwards. I think coming in through these doors of like, what is it that people actually need? So people in Puerto Rico need sources of energy that are local and distributed and are resilient in the face of storms. It turns out that those things are going to help address greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the reason that people will want them or need them. So I think that's one thing. I admire so much the kind of constant education work that John is doing. One of the things that we really thought about in Drawdown was trying to be really conscientious of stripping out as much jargon as we could, and also explaining the things that we did use, right? So like in the copy, the body copy, you will never see CO2, CH4. You'll see just carbon dioxide, right? Written out because it's like just a little bit more accessible to people who aren't talking about these things day to day. Frankly, the whole goal of Drawdown kind of gets at some of this, right? Like 2 degrees. What does that mean to anyone?
Arbitrary.
It's a bit arbitrary-ish. It's also like a sort of underwhelming goal, right, in a lot of ways. So what we tried to do with this term Drawdown was to put forward a goal that is sort of more accessible to people, right? That what we're aiming for is this tipping point where we stop increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases and we start to draw them back down. We hit that tipping point where we head back to conditions that are most conducive for life. We could have a whole conversation about the fact that human beings have never lived as a species in greenhouse gas concentrations as high as they are now. So the idea of stabilizing at some terra nova level is absolutely insane. We may think that it's going to be okay, but it's all hypothetical. So let's put forward a goal that we're actually worthy of as a species. We have become who we have become because we've been living in relative climate stability, certainly for the last 12,000 years. So let's try to get back there. And if we don't put forward that kind of goal, no way we're going to achieve it. And I think it has to be a goal that is in more sort of colloquial and conversational parlance. And I don't know that Drawdown is perfect by any means, but I think it's more intuitive.
And that is like coming really soon. So it's a complete rework of our economy to, you know, to depend on entirely different sources of energy and to produce food in a much more efficient and different way, like largely. So it's a major overhaul, remake. I think it's important to have those like benchmarks so that people get what is really required if we want to quote fix or even like address this problem. I think until you start saying things like 2 degrees or like 0 emissions, you know, you don't have this sense of what it really takes. Then you get in this territory of like, just change your light bulbs and like bike sometimes and like it's cool. And like those things help and do matter, but it's like not, you know, adding up to the global scale of change that's needed. Yeah. And then I will just say like in defense of like, I think I understand that not everyone in the world is going to want to get into the nuances of climate policy and science wonkery, but I think that we should give everyone a chance to understand the basics of it, and that it's on like us in the media, especially like to try to make that accessible and interesting. And I think that like part of it is like just how like, you know, our democracy functions. Like there has to be a level of understanding and then outrage to lead to policies like carbon taxes that political scientists and economists say will get us to a situation where we can start even like, you know, getting at the 2 degrees goal, much less drawdown. So I think that you need this groundswell of first understanding and then that to translate into some sort of understanding of the solutions and what can be done, which I think has been wholly missing largely from how we have a public conversation about this. And that's like the real value in my mind of having what Drawdown provides, which is a list of solutions and a ranking of how well they work and how much money they're going to save us. Right. So like that's, you know, a key like toolbox that we can all look at and pull from and not, you know, sink into the despair of climate, which is, you know, as you talked about, I have those feelings too sometimes, so that you can sink into if you really are living this topic.
Yeah. And just to sort of build just a little further, you know, I think what happens with this 2 degrees thing, right, is that we get locked into this idea that like our great hope, our great achievement will be averting worldwide catastrophe.
Better than worldwide catastrophe.
I mean, it is better, but like as a thing that's like, hey, come and join us. You know, we think a lot about catastrophe and how we might have a slim chance of avoiding it. Like, I don't want to hang out with those people. Yeah. You know? So what is it, right? What's the vision, right? We're really good, the alarmed folks among us. We are really good at the I have a nightmare speech. But we have to get better at the vision, at the dream, right?
So let's transition into vision.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So first I want to say that I was, in terms of the book, and again, if you don't have your copy, get a copy. I was just so impressed with the way the book was put together, the photography, the ease of reading, and then the corresponding website as well, which is drawdown.org. Mm-hmm. In terms of solutions, you know, we've got the usual players. We have solar, we have wind, we have electric cars. We all know that those are important building blocks for this. But I was really surprised with the number one solution, which was refrigerant management. Now, is that sexy or what? Can we talk about refrigerant management a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll sort of set it in context, which is to say there were so many surprises in doing the math. We have this amazing group of advisors, 130 or so advisors, who are some of the world's experts on climate science and climate solutions, and nobody knew the top 5. Nobody got more than 1 of the top 5, right? Whoa, we've got IPCC lead authors who cannot tell us the top 5 climate solutions. Like this is not good, right? So the number 1 was also deeply surprising. Think back to 1987, Montreal Protocol mandated the phase out of ozone-destroying refrigerant chemicals, right? So the things that are in every AC unit and refrigerator. The main replacement chemical for those, hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, on the one hand, great, because they have a very small negative impact on the ozone layer, but they turn out to have an absolutely enormous global warming potential. So in terms of their greenhouse effect, they're 1,000 or more times as effective at trapping heat as carbon dioxide.
There's a win.
Awesome,
Yes.
right? Yeah, you can imagine the ozone layer being like, it's cool, just sacrifice me, you know?
Right.
So one piece of hugely awesome news that we sort of missed because we were in the middle of an election last year was that last October, the countries of the world came together in Kigali, Rwanda, and agreed to amend the Montreal Protocol to mandate the phase out of hydrofluorocarbons over the coming decades. Really, really huge achievement because unlike the Paris Agreement, the Montreal Protocol is binding. So there are targets and timetables and, you know.
This is something the current administration can't do anything about.
As I understand it, we're locked into it. So the EPA under Obama kind of got out in front of some of these timelines, and there's some legal stuff going on with that. But in terms of 2024 phase out of HFCs, that's coming. And so even no matter what this administration does, I think the HVAC and refrigerant industry knows what's coming, right? They're gonna kind of keep progressing. What we looked at in Drawdown was not even the impact of the Kigali Agreement. We didn't include that in the numbers, but we looked at what's the impact of managing leaks and proper disposal of HFCs that are already in circulation and we're going to come into circulation even as we head towards phase out.
So the number one issue is not anything other than just simply leaks and people not disposing properly of their
Mostly
refrigerators and HVAC units.
Yeah. The other thing that's really interesting in this space is that one of the alternative refrigerants that's coming into use primarily in kind of big commercial systems is carbon dioxide. Kind of
We've got a lot of that.
an interesting thing.
So
the potential impact for this solution and all of the modeling we did tries to be a bit conservative. So we looked at kind of if you scale this solution sort of vigorously but plausibly, you know, we wanted the criticism to be, hey guys, it could be a lot more than this, not you're crazy.
Right.
This solution alone could have about 90 gigatons of avoided emissions.
And what does that mean?
Between 2020 and 2050. So a gigaton is 1 billion tons. Last year we emitted globally about 36 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So this, you know, think of this as sort of roughly 3 years worth of emissions from this solution. For those who were there last night, we talked about this. I think about it, a cow is about a ton. So for every gigaton, imagine 1 billion cows worth of a greenhouse gas.
Wow.
Good visual.
Yeah,
Right?
it is. Another solution that I was really surprised about, and I think you probably both can talk to this because it's a people solution, was the category of women and girls. Can you speak a little bit about the social side of things as opposed to just the technological side?
Yeah. So there's the book is and the work is organized into sectors, and one of the sectors is women and girls. So we looked at 3 solutions that are essentially focused on the rights and well-being and opportunity of girls and women. Educating girls, family planning, and then women smallholder farmers, which is focused on sort of closing the gap in access that women farming very small plots of land have as opposed to their male counterparts, and increasing the yields when you increase access to capital and land rights, these sorts of things. Educating girls and family planning come in at numbers 6 and 7 out of 80. And they're really solutions that begin and end with rights. So there are 130 million girls around the world who are not in school, although they're school age. And it's a particular problem in secondary classrooms. There are so many reasons why educating girls is important. You can probably name many of them. They range from lowering rates of HIV, AIDS, and malaria to increased wages and upward mobility, on and on and on. It also turns out that with more years of schooling, women choose to have fewer children, and the children that they do have are healthier, and there are more resources invested in them. So there's sort of an empowerment and a family size and spacing component to education, right? We've seen this in our own country. Well, and then if that's what you want to do to be able to manage the size and spacing of your children and your family, you're going to do that through contraception, right? And sort of basic reproductive health care. So they're very, very connected, these two solutions. And if you add them up, it turns out that empowering women and girls is the #1 solution to global warming.
Think about that.
So not forget, we have to have turbines and solar panels and electric vehicles, right? But there are a whole lot of people who may really care about the empowerment of women and girls who can drive a lot of change in that space. And you don't ever have to talk about climate change. So I think it's a great example of these many, many positive ripple effects that some of these solutions can have on some of our most intractable problems globally. And among them is global warming.
Does that relate to any of the stories that you've covered?
I would just say, like, generally that, like, when this book came out, like, I think it was, like, really shocking to a lot of people who write about climate change all the time, who think about climate change all the time. There are these massive blind spots in the way that we've been thinking about this and talking about it, and there are many more opportunities than had been acknowledged. And I think that there was some, and probably still is, reticence on the part of the environmental community to broaden the conversation beyond fossil fuels. And I think that there are good reasons for that, because we have to do that too. And there is a lot of money behind not doing that, and, like, sort of spreading the blame across, like, 100 different things. I think that there's a fear that, like, oh, people just think, okay, we can just, like, invest in education programs and we're going to burn as much coal as we want, and, like, it's cool, which isn't true. Right. But it's like
that's not going to work.
You need this, like, more holistic conversation that includes both. I also don't like this either or fight. Like, I don't know if you all saw the documentary Cowspiracy that came out, like, a couple years ago. People who are outraged by that documentary email me, like, constantly still, about how, you know, the media is basically conspiring not to talk about the role that agriculture has in global warming, and particularly, like, eating beef and lamb, like, has a huge effect on, you know, an individual's carbon footprint. Cut that stuff out, trade it for chicken or better, you know, vegetables, and, you know, you go a long way to reducing your own carbon footprint, as I'm sure the alarmed knows. But it got framed in that film and in all the emails that I get as a conspiracy. Like, the environmental movement is trying to, and journalists are trying to squash this information, and they don't want you to know because it's like some big cover-up. And it isn't that. It's just, like, this issue is confusing and big and scary as it is. And I think that there were people who were trying to, like, constrain and simplify it in a way that made it, you know, bad pun, but, like, digestible. And I think that there's a fault in that, and there is wisdom in looking at this holistically and saying, like, we got to do all this stuff, but the tools that we have are much more numerous than just, you know, like, ending coal, which has been what the Sierra Club and NRDC and, like, the big environmental advocates have been saying. So.
Right.
And I think, you know, there's this deeply dangerous mythology that there will be a silver bullet.
Right.
Yeah.
And there will absolutely not be a silver bullet, right? A system created this problem, and a system is going to have to solve it. And what I think is so wonderful about this kind of wider aperture for looking at solutions is that there are so many footholds for anyone. Right? So traditionally, if you look at, like, the Princeton wedges, right, work, it's like, well, if you're not a utility company or a car manufacturer or a fossil fuel company, then, like, what are you supposed to do? What's the role for farmers? What's the role for children? What I hope is that what Drawdown does is kind of show there are so many footholds for action, And we need action on all of these things,
Right.
and then some.
Well, and I think this sort of leads into sort of the next topic I wanted to look at, which is the transitional and what I would probably call more pragmatic strategies. You call out bad ideas like things like biomass, waste to energy facilities, but you still include them in the book. One of the things, we're going back to food as well, you detail switching to a plant-rich diet, but yet there's several different strategies on grazing, managed grazing and silvopasturing. Can you talk about sort of this, this way to resolve, what we might call good versus bad, or sort of expand on what you were just talking about?
So we we talk about how the vast majority of the solutions in Drawdown are no regrets solutions. So regardless of global warming, there are things that we would probably want to do because of the other benefits. There are a handful that we call potentially regrets solutions. And I would say that even in the no regrets solutions, we talk about yeah buts. Mm-hmm. So yes, geothermal is great. Also, some of these like advanced geothermal strategies can have some of the same impacts of fracking in terms of micro earthquakes, right? So we try not to be ideologues, right, on any of these things, but to say, yeah, super effective on these things. Here are the advantages. Need to be thoughtful, right, about X, Y, or Z. On the regret solutions, there's sort of a lot more yeah buts, basically. Biomass energy, waste to energy, and nuclear are really the big three. So our role, as we saw it at Drawdown, was to do the math, right? It turns out that we have a pretty hopeful message of possibility. That is not what we set out to do. We set out to just do the math and understand what's in the toolbox and how good is the toolbox, basically. Right. And on the basis of doing the math on emissions reductions, there is potential for nuclear. It's not as much as the big proponents of nuclear would lead you to think, because it's slow and expensive to bring it online. But then we talk about, well, here are the social and environmental risks or potential downsides, right? There are other reasons why we might not want to go down this path. So we try to sort of put that out there to digest. But I think the reality is that the transition that's going to happen over the next 30 years is going to be messy. Okay, so most folks are alarmed. Who's giving up burgers forever? Right?
Or bacon.
Or bacon forever, right? So some of us, but not everyone, right? So yes, we need to get people eating more what we called plant-rich diets. I really would have loved to be like, the whole world goes vegetarian. That is not what we did the math on, right? But so people are going to keep eating some burgers. So how do we then raise livestock in a way that sequesters carbon in the soil and in trees, even as we sort of like teeter towards less meat overall? I think it's just going to be a little messy.
John, do you see the opportunity for folks to maybe take some of this information and sort of spread misinformation about the message?
It could be. There always is that risk, especially on complicated topics that have lots going on. It makes an opportunity for someone with an interest to throw a lot of money at saying the wrong thing, and people will be confused enough to believe it. I think that's happened on climate change. I like hearing that discussion.
Wait, it has?
You may have heard. Merchants of Doubt, read it. I think a lot about, we're talking about like, would you give up burgers? Like I think a lot about the individual like acts that we all can choose to do to be involved in trying to reduce our carbon footprint. And I also, this comes again from my email inbox, like people emailing me and being like where did the power that runs your laptops? You could write that story. Like, where did that come from? Did it come from coal? And like it's essentially impossible to completely disconnect from any of these systems and be a functioning, working human. But that doesn't mean we don't have any responsibility. And I don't know. I did this story. a couple months ago on this sounds like so long ago, but on the floods that were in and around Baton Rouge, not this summer, but the summer before. And in the years since then, you all may have read some about this, but there was a climate attribution study that was done to try to basically look for our fingerprints on that storm and say what aspects of this were climate change. And this is like a fairly new in the last decade branch of science. And I think hugely interesting from a public service perspective, because we can say increasingly when these studies are done, you know, this much of this was us. Like, this is abnormal in these ways. It was more likely to play out in this way and to be more intense, you know, because of greenhouse gas emissions. And in talking to people about that story, I wrote about a woman, Stacey Ruffin, who died in that storm. And I was basically raising the question of, like, what killed Stacey Ruffin? And talked to her family about this. I talked to ethicists about this. I talked to, you know, climate policy people, and all kind of getting at this question of, like, who's to blame in a broad sense, and then, you know, in this one micro sense. And, you know, there are like kind of three categories that you can go with here. Like, there are individuals, like, you know, our individual actions contribute to this. There are corporations, you know, there are lawsuits or like investigations into the whole like Exxon new phenomena, you know, like that they hid climate science from the 70s that would have made things a lot clearer sooner. There are, you know, studies coming out that show these 90 corporations are responsible for X% of observed warming. I mean, there's a lot of effort to like look at the role of corporations, and then governments. And you all may have read about a lawsuit that's happening in the US where a bunch of kids in federal court in Oregon are suing the federal government over relative inaction on climate change. And they're claiming specific harms. Like, one of the kids is like a 9 or 10-year-old from Florida, and he's like, I won't be able to live in my parents' house when I'm an adult because of sea level rise. And so they're targeting like the government. The government should be making policies to fix this. And I think the frustrating thing about climate change is it's like it is all of those things, and it's all wrapped up together. And I can't tell you how to think about your individual actions in this context. I personally get frustrated when individuals get blamed for all these problems because you know, the governments have known about this for a long time, and there are policy mechanisms that would make it a lot better. Corporations the same. But I do think that, like, in terms of especially connecting an individual to these big global issues, that individual actions matter, and they like some of the actions really do add up. So you can't totally disconnect from that either. So maybe that's not very satisfying to think of it in that way, but I think thinking about the complicated morality of the system that we live in right now, and the more emissions we put into the atmosphere, the more messy that gets, the more supercharged our storms become, the more all of our linkages to these problems around the world become, you know, dramatic and clear. So I think I don't have answers on it, but it's something that we all, you know, need to be wrestling with and thinking about in that linear way.
To move forward a little bit here, Coming Attractions is sort of the end of the book, and it's technologies and solutions and things that aren't here yet, but could be sometime in the near future. And one of the ones that I thought was the most interesting is something called repopulating the mammoth steppe. What the heck is repopulating the mammoth steppe?
This is a really fun one, and I will say there's a, if you're intrigued by this, read the copy in the book, but also there's a great video on the Atlantic website about this. So there is a father-son scientist duo in Siberia who have created this thing called the Pleistocene Park. Okay, mammoths, right?
Nice.
This subarctic used to be inhabited by herbivores until we killed them, for the most part.
Ate them.
We killed them and we ate them. So mammoths, oxen, reindeer, really fat, furry horses. It turns out that those herbivores, right, as they go about their lives of trying to graze, they're sort of shuffling along and like moving their, you know, their little noses along the ground and pushing snow out of the way to get to grasses and things. When you do that push away of the snow, you remove an insulating layer, and the temperature of the soil drops just maybe a couple degrees, but it may be just enough to keep that soil frozen. So to keep the permafrost, which holds a lot of the greenhouse gas methane, stable, so that we don't end up having this big release of methane out of the permafrost in the subarctic. So, so cool. These guys are amazing. I mean, they have begged, borrowed, and stolen, maybe not stolen, but almost, herbivores to bring into this Pleistocene park, which is meant to be kind of a demonstration and a proving out of this hypothesis that if we bring the herbivores back to this giant ecosystem, that is a huge part of the solution. And there are even now folks at MIT working on recreating the woolly mammoth, which I think is basically going to be sort of a furry elephant. But I think that's very exciting. But they're just like, they're these, they're like all alone in the wilds of Siberia, right? Trying to figure this out. And what I love about it, and what I love about the section on coming attractions, is you get these great stories of people who are thinking in new boxes, right? They are deeply creative and committed and in many cases collaborative. And I think they're evidence of how very much humanity actually is on the case, even as we see all the ways that we're not on the case, or we're actively forward momentum. And I think the entirety of Drawdown, but especially that section, leaves you thinking not just that human beings are terrible, horrible, no good, very bad, greedy, lazy, incompetent, lying schmucks, but also
how do you really feel?
Yeah, right? But like, that's the story that we're telling about ourselves most of the time. Like, well, why would we want to save that species? Like, they sound terrible,
right.
Well, there are these other ways that we show up that are, sometimes gutsy and brilliant and compassionate. And I think we have to remember that side of the story. And these folks, the Zemovs in Siberia, are, I think, such great evidence of that.
Is there any particular solution, John, in the book that is your favorite, that you're most excited about?
I mean, like I said, I thought like the holistic punch of like, there are all these solutions that are really effective, and some of them, including educating, girls, refrigerants, like those were the two in the top 10 zone that really like kind of punched me in the gut as being way outside the conversation. But I think like in a general way, I think that you're totally right. I mean, I think that the solutions part of this has gone underreported in the media, under-discussed among climate activists. Like you have to say, like, if you're raising all these problems, like you have to be able to say, here's an alternative. And I think that you all are doing that really convincingly.